Today I'll share with you the only 3 things that you can do to minimize your risk of injury as a runner. First, I'm going to give you the general principles, and then I'll go into a bit more detail and show you how I am applying them while dealing with a recent flare-up of shin splints, which is something that I've been dealing with on and off for a couple of years now. These principles all work together, and for the best results, you should probably try to utilize them all to some extent. Quick disclaimer, I'm not a physical therapist or a doctor, and this is not medical advice. This is all based on my experience as a runner, a somewhat injury-prone runner, and also a running coach. And I would also like to point out that a lot of these ideas are something that I got from a great YouTube channel called E3 Rehab, and I recommend checking him out for some quality stuff on injury rehab and prevention. First, let's define some terms. And the first term I want you to understand is load. And that's simply a measure of the amount and intensity of physical exercise that you're placing on your body. The second term is capacity, and that just refers to the maximum amount of physical stress that your body can tolerate and adapt to. So with that in mind, the first principle is pretty simple, and that is decrease load. And this is the easiest to overlook. Runners tend to see this as a last resort after they've tried every supplement out there, stretching in every way imaginable, and doing massage therapy. But in many cases, you absolutely have to start with this so that you don't make your injury worse. If you are feeling stiffness or pain or something like that, it's very likely that your training load has just crossed above your capacity, and you need to decrease it momentarily so that you can continue training. Now, the things that you can do to decrease your training load are quite simple. You can run fewer kilometers, you can run at lower intensities, meaning slower. You can do cross training instead of running to reduce the impact forces, or you can rest altogether. And this sounds so simple, but becoming an expert in this first step can save you so much headache. Often the runners I coach will develop some random pain and write about it in their training log. And the first thing I do is just look at their recent training load. And often I will see that a runner that tends to run 4 times a week has maybe crammed 3 of their runs into Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then forgotten that the body doesn't just reset on Monday and then they run again on Monday, Tuesday. So a runner who normally runs 4 times a week has crammed 5 training sessions on 5 days. As I said, it's so easy to overlook this and think that you have to do some type of stretching to relieve this, but most often you just have to rest a bit and manage your training load. But I know that as a runner, it can be super difficult to dial back on training. You feel like you are missing out on important training sessions and that you will probably lose all your fitness that you worked so hard to earn. But you have to remember that maintaining fitness is way easier than improving fitness. So let's imagine that you start getting some random hip pain, and in order to relieve yourself of the symptoms, you have to decrease your training volume by, let's say, 30 to 50%. It's easy to feel like this is the end of the world, but if this reduces your symptoms, in the worst case scenario, you'll do this for 2-3 weeks, and at the end of that period, you will have less symptoms and pretty much the same fitness, and you can continue working from there. This is so much better than actually continuing to train, making the injury worse, and then being totally unable to train for a month. That will actually cause you to lose fitness. So if you're worried about your fitness, you have to learn to manage your training load. Now, that was the boring principle. Let's move on to the second one, which is increase capacity. Of course, it's not always enough just to get rid of the pain that you're having, because ideally you would want to return to the training that you were doing and probably increase your training load so that you can continue getting PRs. So we have to do something to increase our capacity to train. Now, this step is a bit more complicated because it might not always be clear what you have to do to increase your capacity. So let's say you're having some knee pain. Should you strengthen your knee, or is it maybe a problem with your hip? You can't always tell, and therefore I really recommend working with a physical therapist if you're having any sort of prolonged injury. This has helped me immensely through my injuries, and I'll go more into that later in the video. So for your specific injury, you might need to do some specific exercises, but as a general rule, just doing any strength training will go such a long way. And this does not need to be complicated. I'll just recommend doing some type of squat, some type of hip hinge, like a Romanian deadlift, for example, some type of lunge or a step up, and then maybe something for your gluteus medius. Optional is stuff for your core and upper body. But I want to talk about another overlooked aspect of increasing your capacity, and that is simply to run consistently. Because if you want to be able to run 60 kilometers a week, there are really no exercises or stretches or anything that you can do to prepare yourself for that better than just running 55 kilometers a week consistently. And what's the best way to prepare yourself for 55 kilometers a week? It's running 50 kilometers a week consistently. So you should actually look at your training not only as a way to improve your fitness, but also as a way to prepare yourself for future training and increase your capacity to tolerate the training. And the key word here is consistency. If you yo-yo back and forth, maybe running 3 times a week, then 1 time a week, then 4 times a week, and then nothing for a couple of weeks, you are really just asking for injuries to occur. But if you stay consistent, your body will, of course, adapt to the training load that's being placed on it, and that will gradually increase your capacity. And to demonstrate that, I want to show you a little drawing I did. We can view our capacity as this line, and our training load will be placed somewhere on the same axis. If our training load is way below our current capacity, it's actually likely that our capacity will decrease with time. If, however, we train very close to but still under our current capacity, we will slowly push that capacity upwards, and that means we can tolerate more training with time. If, however, we train consistently above our current capacity, we will not be able to recover from session to session, and if we continue, our capacity will decrease with time. Now, the third principle is quite simple, and that is to increase recovery and adaptation. Because our capacity is not just a steady line, it's very affected by how recovered we are. For example, if you do a really hard track workout and you don't eat for 24 hours and you have really poor sleep, your capacity the next day will be severely affected, and it will be way less than if you had actually eaten something afterwards and slept enough. And as you can imagine, this is very connected to the other principles. It's really just a magnifier of both of those. Because if you recover better, it will have the same effect on your body as decreasing the load slightly. You'll feel the same effects in a couple of days. And it also helps you come back stronger to build your capacity to train more in the future. Now, what is it exactly that helps you recover? A lot of runners think that stretching will help you recover, or you need some special supplements. Often people are majoring in the minors, and really the things you should be focused on is sleeping enough. If you're not doing that, any sort of recovery hack you're doing is completely pointless. And that often means around 8 hours or even more for some people. Eating enough protein, I would recommend for most runners at least 100 to 120 grams of protein per day, maybe more if you're on the heavier side. And eating enough calories in general. If you don't have the building blocks to repair your body, no amount of stretching or other supplements or whatever can help you. So sleep enough, eat enough, and the last one is just to minimize stress. If you are constantly working, training, doing chores, doing errands, organizing your day, and you never get a chance to rest and relax, your body will not start recovering. Now, everything you do to manage injuries, to try to minimize the risk of injuries, it has to fall into one of these categories. It has to decrease the load, increase your capacity, or improve your recovery and adaptation. If you get some recommendation for whatever thing to try, you have to think to yourself, can this possibly do any of these things? So that was the theory. Let's have a look at how this might play out in real life. And the reason I decided to make this video was that a couple of weeks ago, I had a flare-up of my shin splints. My shin splints. You can hear by the sound of it that we have sort of a relationship going on. It's been going on for a couple of years now, on and off, but recently training has been going super well. These last, I would say, 8 months or so, I have been able to train almost without any interference of that injury, and I've been able to get great improvements, some PRs, which has been fantastic. But a couple of weeks ago, I felt the exact same pain in the exact same location, and it was behaving in the same way. So I knew it was the same injury. And before we go into what I did to manage the injury, I think it's very helpful to look at what was happening when the injury came back. Now, if I look at my training, it was actually really steady. Nothing crazy happening there. But remember, this is all an interplay of load, capacity, and your recovery. So let's have a look at the other aspects. Now, when the injury started coming back, I was actually traveling. And normally when I travel, my sleep and nutrition schedule go to shit. And that was the case this time. And I was also just under a bit more stress because I wasn't in my normal routine. I didn't know what I was going to be doing each day. And I was also trying to coordinate a lot because I was spending time in my home country for 1 week and I was trying to meet as many people as possible. When I got home, I did not go straight into my routine. Instead, I had some friends visiting me and I drank a lot of alcohol with them, slept not so much, so that was also not helping me. During all this period of traveling and having guests, I also stopped doing the exercises that my physical therapist recommended me. So you can see there's a lot of things coming together. Due to the poor nutrition and sleep, my recovery is severely affected. More stress has the same effect. Not doing my physical therapy exercises has contributed to less capacity. So even though my training load is the same, all of the other factors are working against me. Previously, when I have had flare-ups of my injury, I have tended to panic a lot and just think like, why is this happening? Why is this happening? Oh no, I don't deserve this or something like that. But now, since I understand injuries a bit more, it was easier for me to keep my head clear and just look at the whole situation, analyze these 3 factors and realize that, okay, this is actually a very normal response to the situation that my body was in. So what I did to manage my injury was, number 1, like I said, decrease the load. This cannot be overlooked. So there were a couple of runs that I shortened. So when I started feeling pain, I just decided to turn back and run home, not aggravate it any further. I started foam rolling again, and this is more of a hypothesis. I can't be totally sure that this is helping my injury, but while training was going well, I was constantly foam rolling my calves. So I started doing that again. I did cross train when I felt the pain was a bit too much. And the most important part was that I started again regularly doing my physical therapy exercises. So the injury that I have is shin splints on the inner side of my shin. And the exercises that I've been doing is a seated isometric calf raise, standing isometric calf raise with my big toe elevated, walks on my tippy toes with some weights, and this exercise that I don't know what it's called. So it took me about 1 to 2 weeks to be able to train properly again. Now, that's what I did to recover from my injury. I was quite lucky that it only took about a week or 2. It can take way longer, of course, and in certain cases, you might need to decrease your load considerably while you are working on your capacity to train. For example, when I started doing these exercises from my physical therapist, I was actually quite sore in my calves afterwards, and running on them actually felt quite painful. So you need to keep in mind that if your training load is the same and you add extra training to increase your capacity, it might be too much. Anyway, now I'm rambling, so I'm gonna wrap up the video. Last reminder I want to give you is that sometimes injuries just happen and they don't really make sense and it's impossible to understand them. So even though right here we're trying to be super analytical, control everything, you need to remember that sometimes you just can't control how your body reacts to everything. And you might get injured even though you feel like you're doing everything correct. You might do a lot of dumb stuff and still stay super healthy. So this can be random and kind of need to smile through it all. If you want to get the whole story of how I originally came back from this injury and got my first PR in 3 years, you can watch that here. And I also recommend checking out E3 Rehab, the channel I mentioned at the start of the video. I'll link that below. I'll also link my free email newsletter if you want some training tips in your inbox once a week. Yeah, and follow me on Instagram, that's also there. Subscribe to the channel, do all those good things if you want, and I'll see you in the next one.